How are we doing in the back? Are we Zooming? Yeah? Okay, great. Well, welcome everybody to the Emerging Science of Animal Consciousness Conference. My name is Jeff Sebo. I teach animal studies here at NYU, and I am honored to be hosting this conference today with my colleagues Kristen Andrews from York University and Jonathan Birch from the London School of Economics. And we have a great event planned for you. After 10 years of rapid progress in the science of animal consciousness, this is an excellent time to take stock, identify areas of agreement and disagreement, pathways for future research, implications for public policy. So we will be doing that today with morning sessions on the methodology for studying animal consciousness and evidence regarding consciousness in vertebrates, afternoon sessions about evidence regarding consciousness in invertebrates and implications for public policy at the local and global levels. Everybody tuning in person and online, will be able to participate throughout the day, asking questions and comments. Those of you who are here in person, we also have coffee breaks and a reception at the end, so it should be a great day. But before we start, I also am very happy to share that this event today is not only a conference on the emerging science of animal consciousness, but also the launch event for the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness.
Thanks very much, Jeff. Thanks to all of you for coming to our event. I agree with Jeff totally that this is a really, really exciting time for the science of animal minds, and that the last 10 years have seen really exciting advances. Findings that are making us think there are surprisingly rich inner lives in a surprisingly wide range of animals, including many invertebrates, like octopuses and crabs and lobsters and insects. Throughout the day, we'll be hearing about that evidence that I think has been shifting opinions over the last 10 years. But in preparing this event, we thought, well, it's not just an exciting time because of these results, but also because of the community that is emerging. We've got more people working on these topics than ever before. We've got more open, overt discussion of questions of consciousness in other animals than I think we've seen before. And we've got people working on many, many different animals in relation to these questions. There's now a critical mass of people. There's now this emerging science of animal consciousness. And so we thought, the three of us, around last October, what could we do to try and crystallize that development and show to people that, look, there is now this emerging science where there wasn't perhaps a recognizable field in the past. And we came up with this idea that, well, it would be good to have a statement that tries to capture what it is people from all across these disciplines and all of these biological taxa actually agree on. And so we held a series of online meetings where, with a group of about 40 people who are key players in this field, we tried to work out, well, what is it people actually agree on? And we produced this declaration, this short text, the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness, that aims to try and pin that down. It says the following. It says, which animals have the capacity for conscious experience? While much uncertainty remains, some points of wide agreement have emerged. First, there is strong scientific support for attributions of conscious experience to other mammals and to birds. Second, the empirical evidence indicates at least a realistic possibility of conscious experience in all vertebrates, including reptiles, amphibians, and fishes, and many invertebrates, including, at minimum, the cephalopod mollusks, the decapod crustaceans, and the insects. And third, when there is a realistic possibility of conscious experience in an animal, it is irresponsible to ignore that possibility in decisions affecting that animal. We should consider welfare risks, and we should use the evidence to inform our responses to those risks. There'll be much more in this session and in later sessions unpacking this, talking about what the terms in it mean. But first, I'll hand over to Kristen to explain who our group of 40 initial signatories are.
Yeah, thanks everybody. So we were very excited to be working with an eminent group of scientists and philosophers on creating this declaration. The initial signatories couldn't all be here today in person. Many of you are online sharing this moment with us. right now virtually from around the world. So we're taking this moment to virtually and kind of ceremonially sign the declaration. We have representatives who have studied human consciousness. We have philosophers and scientists who have worked on theories of consciousness. We also have scientists who've worked on so many different animal taxa, including everything from fishes, Colin Brown, reptiles, Gordon Burkhardt, bees, Lars Chitka, and let's see, Matilda Gibbons, also bees. I'm going to show the next slide so you can see some of the other people. Also, we have Noah Miller, who's worked on fish. We have Diana Reese, who's worked on dolphins. And this kind of range of scholarship that we see in different taxa, vertebrate as well as invertebrate taxa, has shown us that there is this consensus that's growing across the sciences, across researchers who are working on different species, that consciousness is a topic that we should be doing research on, that we can be doing research on, and that we are doing research on right now. And the discoveries that are coming out of that science is incredibly exciting. So we're happy to share with you a lot of this research today.
So today is going to be an opportunity both to assess the science and to unpack this declaration and see why some people have chosen to sign it, and to now invite other people to sign it as well. So if you are here in the room or watching online or watching a recording later on, you can now go to our website, which is live as of this morning, nydeclaration.com. And you can read the declaration, you can see the list of initial signatories, and anyone with relevant expertise in science and philosophy and policy, broadly construed, is very welcome to add your signature by following the instructions on that website. Again, the website is nydeclaration.com. And with that, I want to thank you all again for being here. Thank Kristen and Jonathan for co-organizing this with me. Thank NYU Animal Studies, the NYU Center for Bioethics, the NYU Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness for co-sponsoring this event alongside the Mind, Ethics, and Policy program and the Wild Animal Welfare program. And this will happen multiple times today. Thank Sophia Fogel and Tony Sims for actually organizing all of the logistics of this event. Thank you both. And I am now going to go straight into the first session by introducing our distinguished moderator. And by the way, all of the moderators and speakers at the event today are also signatories to the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness. David Chalmers is University Professor of Philosophy and Neuroscience and co-director of the Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness at New York University. His research examines philosophy of mind, especially consciousness, and the foundations of cognitive science, physics, and technology, as well as the philosophy of language, metaphysics, and epistemology, and many other areas. Thank you, David.
Okay, well, thank you, Jeff, and congratulations to all on this New York Declaration. This is the session on scientific methodology. We'll be examining some, I guess, historical and philosophical perspectives on some of the methodology for studying animal consciousness. The two speakers are both philosophers who you've met already, Kristen Andrews and Jonathan Birch. To introduce Kristen, she's professor of philosophy and York Research Chair in Animal Minds at York University. She's the author of a whole lot of work on animal minds, animal consciousness, animal social cognition, animal personhood. At the moment, she's writing a book on these topics, especially around issues of social norms in animal culture called Societies in the Wild. Please welcome Kristen Andrews.
Thanks, Dave, for that introduction. So I wanted to start this meeting by exploring why we need a declaration and what's special about this moment in time. And so let's extremely briefly review just a little bit of intellectual history. A very long intellectual history, but just a very brief bit of it. So for a long time, there was really no question of animal consciousness. That animals have subjective sensory experiences was something that was just taken as common sense. This idea that animals feel was something that for over 1,000 years, philosophers took for granted and discussed questions about. They investigated the sorts of things that animals can feel. They investigated questions about animal rationality and whether animals also can think. And they investigated questions about the relationship between thinking and feeling. Among the figures on this slide, we also have modern scientists who are also taking for granted that the idea of animal consciousness was something we could investigate, not something we had to prove and to make viable before we investigate it. So in the philosophical tradition, discussions of animal consciousness were often emerging in discussions of ethics and the proper treatment of animals. So for example, long before utilitarianism came upon the scene, Abu Bakr al-Razi argued we shouldn't cause pain to anything capable of sensation unless it's deserved or required. And he went on to describe as immoral acts of taking joy from hunting animals or working your horse to exhaustion. So even Immanuel Kant, who famously denied rationality to animals, accepted animals as feeling things. This is clear in his discussion of animal ethics when he writes that any action whereby we may torment animals or let them suffer distress or otherwise treat them without love is demeaning to ourselves. Of course, a thorough review of this philosophical history is beyond us right now, but suffice to say, while in philosophy there was this idea that thinking and feeling could be separated, there was really no idea that behavior and mind could be separated. Behavior and mind went hand in hand. And there was debate about whether or not some animals think, but there was no debate about whether animals have mind, and conscious feeling was thought to be the most basic way in which an animal has minds. Now, this was true, of course, until it wasn't, until Descartes. Descartes took animals to be living machines, writing that they act by force of nature and by springs like a clock. Descartes cleaved apart not thinking and feeling, which was already separately discussed, but he cleaved apart behavior and mind. In this way, he set the stage for behaviorism, but in a sense, he was even more radical, because Descartes denied any mind at all to anything that can't speak. This idea was outrageous. Here we go. Oh, there we go. So this idea was outrageous to those in his own time. In a letter to Descartes, Henry Moore expressed abhorrence regarding that deadly and murderous sentiment which you professed in your method, whereby you snatch away life and sense from all animals. Here, the gleaming rapier edge of your genius arouses in me not so much mistrust as dread. And he goes on, Moore goes on in dramatic fashion to say Descartes is really getting at and destroying what is taken to be common sense, namely that animals feel things. So if we fast forward 400 years to the turn of the 21st century and the emergence of comparative cognition, we see that this new scientific field was battling both behaviorism and a lingering Cartesian skepticism about animal minds, and it had to proceed quite carefully. The cognitive revolution opened up space for psychologists to study animal thought, but at the expense of studying animal feeling. In this new approach to animal minds, we see the inverse of the views that Kant advocated, an entirely different way of promoting animal thinking while putting to the side animal feeling. So as Sarah Shuttleworth wrote in her popular comparative cognition textbook, she wrote, "Most researchers studying animal cognition think that how animals process information can and should be analyzed without making any assumption about what their private experiences are like." And in another textbook, John Pierce wrote, "We're frustrated by the lack of methodology to determine animal consciousness because it's not possible to observe directly the mental state of an animal." Clive Wynne and Monique Udell wrote of consciousness, "It seems positively foolhardy for an animal psychologist to blunder in where even philosophers fear to tread." So these were the perspectives that students of comparative psychology were getting from the textbooks at the turn of the century. Don't study consciousness, it's not scientific. Now, of course, there were outliers. And these outliers had some continuity with these earlier philosophical views, especially coming from folks who were trained in biology and ethology. So Donald Griffin, the discoverer of bat echolocation, wrote a number of books arguing for the importance of studying animal consciousness. In these works, Griffin also made progress by denying some of the traditional divisions between thinking and feeling, arguing that you can't actually study thought without studying feeling as well. And we cannot have a conference on animal consciousness without remarking on the amazing impact of Frans de Waal, who we just sadly lost last month. Frans was never afraid to talk about both animal thought and animal feeling. He didn't care what anyone else had to say. Critics be damned, he was going to talk about feeling, emotion in the animals that he was studying. And the last communication I had with him, he told me he was working on a book on animal consciousness. So I'm really hoping that we will see those efforts at some point before too long. So this scientific tradition that's reflected by Griffin and de Waal can be traced back at least to Darwin, if not to Aristotle. Right? Darwin wrote an entire book about animal emotions, and he famously said there's no fundamental difference between man and the higher mammals in their mental faculties. But it might be more surprising to see that Morgan, C. Lloyd Morgan, also advocated studying animal consciousness. Morgan's canon invites us to prefer the simplest explanation for behavior, but he didn't think we could study animal minds from a point of skepticism. He wrote, "But a skeptical attitude throws more strain upon our credulity than the acceptance of the current belief in conscious control." Morgan thought a good animal psychology included a study of animal consciousness. And then we also have, perhaps also surprisingly, Ivan Pavlov, a famous researcher who studied dog learning. He put it more bluntly when he said, "It would be stupid to reject the subjective world." Such views in pre-behaviorist animal psychology were perhaps best developed by Margaret Floy Washburn, whose textbook, The Animal Mind, which was first published in 1908, foreshadowed much of what's happening right now in the study of animal consciousness. When I read her textbook, I take her to show another path that the science could have taken in the 20th century if we hadn't been derailed by behaviorism. She wrote, "We know not where consciousness begins in the animal world. We know it surely resides in ourselves. We know where it exists beyond a reasonable doubt. And those animals have structures resembling ours, which rapidly adapt themselves to the lessons of experience. Beyond this point, for all we know, it may exist in simpler and simpler forms until we reach the very lowest of living things." So Washburn offered an argument against the skeptic, explaining that psychology doesn't have to resolve the problem of other minds in order to do its job, which was studying the mind of humans and other animals. Rather, it just needs to do the work. It needs to start looking for these things and investigate the variety of mental features in a variety of species across the animal kingdom. Washburn also offered up a methodology for studying animal consciousness, some aspects of which we have rediscovered and are using today in our current science. Washburn gives us a version of what's now known as the facilitation hypothesis, the idea that thought and feeling facilitates action. She provides us with markers of conscious experience, writing that thought and feeling can be inferred from both behavior and from physical structures. She also emphasizes that there are dimensions of consciousness and that we do not assume the kinds of feelings animals have, but we can only discover them through scientific investigation. But she differs a little bit from how things were progressing by advising us to study a wide range of species. She starts chapter 3 in her textbook by discussing the mind and feeling of the amoeba. So today, we've moved forward from behaviorism, and we've been studying animal consciousness again, using many of these methods that Washburn had advised. As Crick and Koch wrote in 1990, we need to assume that some animals are conscious if we're going to do good consciousness science. At that time, though, they thought it wasn't yet profitable to study animals other than the higher mammals. But 35 years later, we're throwing off the last Cartesian chains and returning to what was long a default assumption, that animal feeling is a topic worthy of scientific discovery and philosophical investigation. We've reached the stage where it is profitable to study consciousness in birds, fish, amphibians, reptiles, and invertebrates, such as the octopus, crabs, bees, and even in the flies and the worms. The outputs of this new research are stunning, revealing consciousness of unexpected sorts in new and sometimes surprising places. Many questions remain, including questions about the line between conscious and unconscious beings, and about the very nature of consciousness itself. So it's time for a declaration to serve as a touchstone, a statement of what we now know and what we still need to investigate. With this shifting of the scientific paradigm, we're entering an exciting new era, an era of scientific research that promises to uncover not just which other animals are conscious or how other animals are conscious, but a research program that may help to reveal the very nature of consciousness itself. So thank you, and I look forward to our discussions today.
Okay, we're going to have both talks followed by a discussion. Our second speaker is Jonathan Birch, who's a professor of philosophy at the London School of Economics and principal investigator on the Foundations of Animal Sentience project. Jonathan's done a lot of work on consciousness in animals, and including work which has led to invertebrate animals being included in the Sentience Bill by the UK government. He has a book coming out on these issues quite shortly, summer 2024, called The Edge of Sentience, Risk and Precaution in Humans, Other Animals, and AI. Please welcome Jonathan.
Thanks very much, Dave, and to all of you for attending. And thanks very much, too, to Kristin for setting this talk up so well by giving us the historical background that has led us to this point. The New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness, when you see it, and a reminder of the link, nydeclaration.com, a lot of people's first question is, what is consciousness, then? Many different things one might mean by that term. Our declaration concerns what in philosophy has come to be called phenomenal consciousness, or sentience, or raw feeling, or subjective experience. What I see as the most basic, evolutionarily ancient base layer of human consciousness that includes both sensory experiences. Think, for example, of the experience of a particular touch or taste or sight or odor, but also includes experiences that feel good or feel bad, experiences with valence. For example, the experience of pleasure or pain or hope or fear, joy, excitement, anxiety. This notion of phenomenal consciousness, subjective experience, is what Thomas Nagel had in mind when he famously asked, what is it like to be a bat? And introduced us to this idea that, well, there really is a distinctive problem here of trying to understand not just the processes going on in the brain of a bat as it navigates the world through echolocation, but what all that feels like from the bat's point of view. A question that immediately brings us into contact with serious imaginative limitations. We really, really struggle to imagine what that's like. And sometimes these imaginative limitations lead people to doubt whether scientific evidence can bear on these questions at all. But I think that's wrong, and I think the 39 signatories of our declaration thinks that's wrong as well. The fact that it's very hard to imagine the subjective experiences of other animals does not mean that scientific evidence cannot be used to try and make informed inferences about those experiences. This is also the sense of the word consciousness associated with the hard problem of consciousness. So I think it's a point of agreement that we don't know the nature of this thing. We don't have a theory of consciousness that tells us the fundamental nature of what consciousness is. We have many, many different theories, arguably a lot of them at quite an immature stage. But none of that prevents us from having a science of animal consciousness that engages with these questions scientifically. This sense of the word consciousness must be distinguished from other related things from which it's really quite different. One is intelligence, or reasoning, or sapience, where if an animal has a lot of intelligence, as octopuses arguably do, this gives them more ways in which they can show their sentience to us. It gives us more lines of evidence we can use. But intelligence and consciousness or sentience, they're not the same thing. And so if an animal fails to display signs of intelligence, we can't infer from that that it isn't conscious or sentient. It needs to be distinguished, too, from the capacity to reflect on our experiences and the inner monologue that many but not all humans have as we go through life. Sometimes when we talk about consciousness, we mean these very sophisticated aspects of human consciousness, like the inner monologue. But that's not what we mean in this declaration, and it's not what we mean when talking about other animals. There may be some forms of consciousness that we have that other humans lack. I don't personally think that other animals will have a verbal inner monologue in the way that I do. But equally, there are probably forms of consciousness other animals have that we lack. And this is so clear when thinking about the bat and its echolocation. It has that sensory ability that we don't have, and there'll be some subjective experience associated with that sensory ability that we don't have. And in fact, this is the tip of an iceberg. The animal world is full of forms of experience that transcend anything we have. At the same time, phenomenal consciousness must also be distinguished from reflex responses and non-conscious brain processes. If you think of withdrawing your hand from a hot stove, well, anyone seeing that would infer that you're feeling pain, and they'd probably be right. But in fact, the reflex withdrawal of your hand is in progress before the subjective experience of pain is felt. And it doesn't seem to involve the brain at all. It's controlled by the spinal cord. And so when we're looking for evidence of conscious experiences like pain in other animals, we're always looking for things that go beyond these reflexes, beyond non-conscious brain processes as well, and that are more sophisticated than the reflex responses we display when, for example, withdrawing our hand. But the last 10 years have seen seriously exciting progress in generating evidence of exactly that kind. We will see as we go on through the day many examples, but just to preview some of the things we'll be talking about in the later sessions, example of cuttlefish seemingly planning for the future by delaying gratification, octopuses valuing pain relief and avoiding potentially painful situations, crabs weighing competing motivations against each other, bees apparently playing with balls for no intrinsic reward other than the joy of playing with the ball, fishes passing the so-called mirror mark test, which is one of the most famous and, on the face of it, very demanding tests for self-awareness, and fruit flies displaying not just sleep patterns, but forms of quiet and active sleep that resemble slow wave and REM sleep in humans, and that are disrupted by social isolation, among many other examples that we'll be talking about in due course. We think from all of this and more, a new picture is emerging. A new picture on which research into animal cognition and behavior is not just providing us with information about behavior and about computations going on in the brain, but is also providing us with evidence that is relevant to questions of consciousness, questions of subjective experience, questions of what the animal is feeling. And that forms of consciousness may well be present in a very wide range of animals indeed, so that when we're thinking about the scope of this emerging field, it should not just be the study of mammals or the study of mammals and birds. It should be the study of a very wide range of animals, including all vertebrates and many invertebrates. We also think this picture is showing us that animal consciousness is a serious topic of scientific inquiry with a bright future. Kristin's talk alluded to the skepticism that these questions have sometimes invoked, epitomized by the behaviorist tradition in the early 20th century that completely expunged them from serious psychology. We then saw the cognitive revolution that says, well, psychology is not just the study of behavior, you can also study cognition. But when that happened, questions of consciousness were still marginalized. Since the 90s, we've seen the emergence of a vibrant, active science of human consciousness, drawing heavily on animal evidence, particularly evidence from other primates. But still, sometimes there's been a bit of reluctance to say that the science of consciousness is not just about humans, but about a very wide range of other animals as well. And we think the evidence that's built up over the last 10 years now puts us in the position to challenge even that last residual kind of skepticism. What does the Declaration say? Well, I'll repeat the website, nydeclaration.com, if you want to read both the text of the agreed declaration and also the background. We've put up a summary of the background that led to it. I'll just zoom in on a few crucial aspects of the wording that we ended up agreeing to in the online workshops that have led to this. I think crucially, we're in an area where we need to be thinking about how to communicate uncertainty responsibly. The evidence does not allow us to speak of certainty or proof or conclusive evidence for all the reasons noted earlier to do with the hard problem and our great difficulty in imagining the subjective lives of other animals. But we can speak of markers or indicators, signs, or symptoms. These might be behaviors, they might be brain processes that raise the probability of consciousness. When you see them, consciousness is more likely than it was before you saw them. Think here about the human case. I think even when thinking about other humans around us right now, healthy, awake, adult humans, you're faced with what philosophers call the problem of other minds. You're not absolutely certain. You can't speak of certainty or proof because you can't completely prove in a way that excludes all possibility of doubt that the person sat right next to you is having conscious experiences that are like yours. But we don't genuinely think that there can be no evidence here. In fact, we have an abundance of evidence that the people around us are conscious. It's not just linguistic evidence either. Nonverbal behavior and neural evidence is also relevant. If you think about why you're not as persuaded that ChatGPT is conscious compared with the person next to you, well, ChatGPT can produce a huge amount of linguistic behavior, for sure. But linguistic behavior alone is not the only source of markers. It also matters whether this system has a brain that resembles ours. It also matters whether it behaves non-verbally in ways that are linked to conscious experience in us. And those non-verbal lines of evidence that help convince us in the human case are still there in many other animals. In the human case, we use the method of inference to the best explanation. The best explanation for all of these markers, everything the people around you do in their daily lives, well, it's that they're conscious. And we can use that same basic method of inference to the best explanation when thinking about other animals too. We don't have the verbal markers, but we do have a very wide range of nonverbal markers of different kinds. And so where are we then with different groups of animals? Well, this was one of the key things we discussed in our online meetings. And we do think that when we're thinking about other mammals and birds, we're in the area of saying there is strong scientific support from many, many lines of evidence, all pointing in the same direction, including truly remarkable work like, for example, the Nieder et al. 2020 study with crows, where crows, in effect, were trained to report what they were seeing by moving their heads in and out of a beam of light. Now, some of these lines of evidence that are there in mammals and birds are not there in very many or any other animals. And so we think there are gradations in the evidence that mean the evidence is stronger for mammals and birds than for other animals. We want to emphasize that there is evidence sufficient to establish at least a realistic possibility of consciousness in all other vertebrates, plus the cephalopod mollusks like octopuses, squid, and cuttlefish, the decapod crustaceans like crabs, lobsters, and shrimps, and insects like bees and fruit flies. Where realistic possibility, well, it's a way of communicating uncertainty. It's a way of saying we're not in the territory where this is a remote, really remote chance, like some might say the case of AI consciousness, or some might disagree. Or if you think of the chance of an asteroid hitting the Earth this afternoon, we're not in that territory of remote chance. We're talking about a probability that is high enough to warrant both further scientific investigation as a matter of priority and careful consideration of welfare risks to these animals. Now, undoubtedly, some people in our group, and more generally, would want to go beyond that. They'd want to say it's more than a realistic possibility. It's actually highly likely. But what we're looking for in this statement is a form of words that a very wide range of people can agree to and that captures points of wide agreement, and hence this phrase, at least a realistic possibility. The UK government actually has some guidelines about the sort of language to use when talking about probability and uncertainty, a so-called probability yardstick, in which they recommend that one should talk about realistic possibility when the probability is perhaps not above 50%, but it's clear of around 40%. And so when one says at least a realistic possibility, one is saying, well, maybe it is below 50%, but it's not far below 50% if it is. What do we hope to achieve with this declaration? Well, a new field of animal consciousness research is emerging. It's, to me, a very exciting field because of the way it combines disciplines in a way that we haven't seen before. Look at the journal Animal Sentience, founded by Stephen Harnad 9 years ago. The disciplines represented by the people doing work in this area is enormous, and it includes neuroscience, comparative psychology, my own discipline of philosophy, evolutionary biology, the behavioral sciences, and other areas of the arts and humanities and social sciences as well, including people working in law. But this emerging interdisciplinary field, it needs support. It needs the support of universities and governments and funders. And part of what we want to do with this declaration is emphasize that this field is making progress and deserves your support. It's generating high-quality work that is changing the way we're thinking about other animals. At the same time, there's another message implicit in there as well, I think, which is that this emerging field is not irrelevant to questions of societal importance or to policy challenges. On the contrary, this is an emerging field that really matters for questions of animal welfare. There's then disagreement within the group, as naturally there would be, about what exactly follows when one recognizes an animal as a conscious being, what our ethical obligations are towards it. But the point of agreement is that we need to be considering welfare risks to these animals, and that certainty about consciousness should not be required for being willing to consider welfare risks. The evidence we have now can already inform our approach to welfare issues. You might think, for example, of octopus farming, and how the fact we don't have absolute certainty that octopuses are capable of suffering should not stop us from being concerned about the idea of octopus farming and identifying some welfare risks implicit in that practice. So if you agree with us about these things, and if you have relevant expertise, for example, a PhD in a relevant discipline, we'd really welcome adding you to this statement to show that it really does command the wide agreement of the community. So please do consider signing it. Thanks.
Great. Well, we'll now move to some discussion. Jeff asked me to kick it off with a question for the speakers. Then we'll open things up. I thought I'd ask about where things are in the science of consciousness right now. I mean, there's been a huge amount of progress in recent decades on the science of both human and non-human animal consciousness. Of course, there's also, at the same time, a huge amount that we don't understand and, huge amount of disagreement in the field. And I'm kind of thinking about where this declaration stands in light of that. The declaration hedges its bets in a number of ways. Speaking of a wide agreement that there's that there's a realistic possibility of consciousness in these animals. On the other hand, wide agreement is not universal agreement, and there's still, I take it, plenty of people who at this point may disagree about about some of the central claims. I mean, I don't know, theorists, scientists, and philosophers. I think of my old friend Dan Dennett, who thinks consciousness may have some very deep tie to language, or NYU's own Joe Ledoux, who thinks that consciousness may require higher order processes. The neuroscientist Dan DeHaan, who thinks consciousness may require a global workspace involving quite demanding cognitive processes. I take it they may disagree with some of these claims. At least I didn't see them. I didn't see members of those schools represented among the signers, and that's fine. That's where we are now in the science. But I'm wondering what you see, what the two of you see, as both as the best motivated forms of disagreement with say some of these key points in the Declaration, and what you see as the prospects for moving past that in the coming years and decades to move towards an even stronger consensus on consciousness in non-human animals.
Great, thanks, Dave. I mean, this is a really important question, and I think it's a question that really speaks to the goal of the Declaration, which is to promote more research in animal consciousness. So the theories that exist that are based on higher order thinking or language and require these sorts of capacities for consciousness might just be an artifact of the subjects we're studying when we're studying consciousness. And with more data, I think that we're going to have more evidence that we can use to test theories, to devise new theories. And I just have to add that when I talk to researchers, including some of the scientists who are speaking today about their research in animal sentience, they tell me stories about writing grants and the grants not getting accepted. Because animal sentience was a thing that wasn't being funded, and it's starting to be funded, and we need that sort of research support in order to get the evidence we need, in order to have these conversations with people who aren't part of the consensus at this point.
Yes, thanks. I think as far as the global workspace theory is concerned, I don't see any reason why defenders of that theory would not want to sign on to the statement that we're putting out, because, well, I mean, DeHaan in his own work has emphasized that there might be convergent evolution to something workspace-like even in fishes, and the sort of evidence we'll be talking about in later sessions, I think, is exactly the kind of evidence that should actually raise the probability of that, if that's the sort of evidence you would look for. Now, I agree there could be perhaps a more skeptical view by people who really truly think that there is something very special about the mammalian neocortex, or perhaps even more specifically, perhaps granular prefrontal cortex of the type that is distinctively elaborated in the primate lineage. And I mean, I see this as a possibility too. It's something we can't rule out in our current state of uncertainty. But I suppose I'd ask those people to be open-minded about the possibility they might be wrong. Even if you suspect that the most likely thing is that there's something very special about the neocortex, one should be able to entertain the possibility that these other theories on which there isn't might be right. And then I think you're in the territory of recognizing a realistic possibility of consciousness in a very wide range of animals. So in part here, I'm emphasizing the quite cautious and conservative nature of the language used, particularly the phrase, at least a realistic possibility. In choosing this quite cautious form of language, we really hope we've produced a statement that a very, very wide range of people could sign on to. And I hope that proves to be the case.
Yeah, actually, I thought that realistic possibility was quite cautious language until I saw your chart from the UK government that says we have to be at 40% to have a realistic possibility. So maybe if it was 10%, then that's something that more people could reasonably sign on to.
I think these are vague thresholds. Yeah. These are vague thresholds. And I think qualitatively we're saying it would be inappropriate to talk of it being a remote chance, like an asteroid impact today. And it would be inappropriate to talk of virtual certainty, or even highly likely, I would say. And so looking for language that responsibly communicates that middle range, and realistic possibility was the best we agreed on when thinking about how to do that.
Great, thanks. Let's open it up. I saw Ned Block.
I'm not sure this declaration is a good idea. It's working. So, you know, everybody who works in science is familiar with articles that summarize research that people do not trust because they feel they are cherry-picking the data, they are relying on studies that objective people think are not that good. To have an impact on research being funded, on universities supporting things, you have to have objectivity. To avoid cherry-picking data and relying on bad studies, you need opponents. In a conference like this, there should be people who are opponents, who can say, look, I'm opposed to this, and I think you relied on this study, you neglected this study. And I feel like once you're an advocate, you lose that sense of objectivity. You have to have a sense that you are really taking both sides seriously.
Well, this is not a work of advocacy. I appreciate the lack of softball questions, by the way. In case anyone was fearing that we might have planted some questions in the audience, leaving absolutely no doubt about that. I think that this declaration is not a work of advocacy. It is describing the state of the science as fairly as we can. And implicitly, of course, we want to advocate for the science. We want to say big steps have been taken in the last 10 years, and the state we've got to now is very promising and points towards a bright future. But that's it. Beyond that, there's no specific policy being endorsed. Just the thought that, well, because this science is producing evidence, and that evidence matters to questions of welfare, it does need to be taken into account. But beyond that, there's a very wide range of views among the signatories about what exactly, from an ethical point of view, would follow from this declaration.
Yeah, I'll just add that, Ned, I'm so glad you're here to serve as that counter voice, and I look forward.
I'm actually not an opponent, but I think there should be some higher order.
Yes. You're playing devil's advocate,
Yeah.
but you're saying you
So
should
it's-
have the actual devil.
We look forward to the discussion today, yeah.
Yeah, I'm pretty doubtful about insect consciousness. I would not sign on to a serious possibility of insect consciousness, but I agree about octopus farming. But the thing is, you've got to have people who disagree to show other people that you're honest.
We do, though. I mean, I think you will see disagreement on specific questions against a background of agreement on the things that are in the declaration. And I think that's productive. I think what can be unproductive sometimes is when the debate is at the level of, is this area of research a legitimate area of research or not? Mm-hmm. I don't think that's actually very productive. Mm-hmm. The really interesting debates are about specific results, specific studies, how are they to be interpreted, what's their significance?
Okay, I think we should move on. Sydney?
Oh, it's over here. Professor Andrews, when you were giving your talk, I think one of the first slides you had a bunch of lists of potentially scholarship that explores animal consciousness or just consciousness in general, but at the top was Buddhism. So I wanted to offer maybe a Buddhist perspective. So there's a lot of schools in Buddhism, obviously, but one of the main themes is to lower the sense of self and subjective attachment to the world. So I'm wondering if it's possibly this is an unethical approach to animals, to place consciousness on these animals and subjective awareness and individualization, seeing that these aspects of humans have caused most of the global issues that we have. It seems that they're clearly cognitive, and that's very interesting, and a lot of work can be done there. And if we want to use, this is something that Ned just brought up, like if we want to use this to advocate for the animals, obviously cognition is enough, but it seems, why should we go so far as to add consciousness and egotism to these creatures?
Yeah, so in the first slide, what I was trying to do is capture this view that seems to be expressed very broadly in intellectual traditions that animals do feel something. And you do see this in Buddhist traditions, that animals can suffer, that animals have feelings. Selves, that's a whole nother question, right, for humans as well as animals. And I think that, in some traditions, that's enough if you wanted to do some advocacy work. But in other traditions, right, if you look at a Kantian ethical tradition, that's not going to be perhaps sufficient for all kinds of protections for animals. Certainly some protection, like don't cause unnecessary suffering to the animal. But then there are lots of different kinds of interests animals might have. So I'm not quite sure I'm answering your question, but really what I was just trying to get at was it was a very common sense view that there is some sort of feeling in animals, and it wasn't something that people felt that they had to prove or deny, or answer skeptics about as they did whatever they were doing, right? Be it advocacy or philosophy of mind or
I suppose to the extent that the question was getting at the idea there might be some risks involved on the side of over-attributing consciousness to animals. That seems absolutely right. Yeah, I think it's very important to be guided by the evidence and to not be erring on the side of caution to such an extent that we stop requiring evidence altogether.
Okay, at the back there. Yep.
I think there's a realistic possibility that consciousness has a function, that it evolved, and I think a theory of consciousness would center around what's the value of an animal having a conscious experience versus not, and how would that have evolved? Any thoughts on that?
I think we'll hear a range of views on that during this event. Yeah, I think the Declaration does not comment on this. I personally think among the group of people working on these topics, there is quite wide agreement on consciousness having functions related to learning and decision-making, that it makes certain kinds of sophisticated learning possible, or at least facilitates them. And that's my own view as well. But beyond that, there's a huge amount of uncertainty about what exactly it's doing. What exactly are the kinds of learning or decision-making it facilitates, and why? And this is a priority for future research, to try and gain some better insight on these questions, using both evidence from humans and evidence from other animals. And what I'd really like to see is the work on the humans and on other animals proceeding in tandem, being mutually informing, mutually reinforcing.
and enforcing questions about secure theories of consciousness, as well as the function, evolutionary function of consciousness. Yeah.
Okay, one person over, Benji. Just one person over from the last one.
Hi. So consciousness, as you pointed out, comes in a wide variety. We have visual experiences, we have auditory experiences. But once you start talking about welfare, what I want to focus on is just the ability to feel pleasure and pain. And so if I were wordsmithing the Declaration, as soon as I brought up welfare, I might have brought up the reason we have to worry about their welfare is because some of these animals might be able to feel pain. So that's kind of a comment. And the question would be, do you see intrinsic value in any other kinds of conscious experiences? I could see taking an approach where I don't really care if you can have visual experiences. I don't care if you can reason. What I care about is whether you can feel pain or not.
Well, I'll take that on. I mean, I think that if you're coming from a utilitarian or welfarist perspective, then pain and pleasure are the things you're going to focus on. But in other traditions, I think there are other values as well. So there might be aesthetic values that are associated with visual experience or olfactory experience. There might be social values that also come from certain kinds of social cognitive capacities, cultural practices, and so on. And I don't want to discount those other sorts of values and focus merely on pain. Like, this is my own perspective. I understand that it is a very useful and effective focus in animal welfare science to look at pain. And there's only growing interest, I think, right now in looking at animal pleasure or joy. There is active research on this topic. I think that's very important. But I wouldn't want the focus to be only on pleasure and pain without looking at other possible values for some possible species.
I think, to give my own view, and we can't speak for the entire collective, but my own view is that it is valenced conscious experiences, which is to say experiences that feel bad or feel good, the matter for ethics. But I have quite a broad picture of what valenced experiences can be. And so I don't think it's just pleasure or pain necessarily, but also states like frustration, joy, anxiety. There's a wide range of valent states that matter, I think. And as Kristin says, the research, for understandable reasons, has often focused on pain. And so we have a lot more markers for that and a lot more agreement about what the markers are in relation to pain than for other negatively valent states or for the positively valent ones like joy. And so what I'd really like to see in the future is the field developing lists of markers for joy, for example, that are as sophisticated as the ones that exist for pain.
Okay, I'll take one from the online audience. This is Barbara King. Wonderful work. Thanks to everyone involved. I'd like to ask Jonathan if it isn't an overabundance of caution to say that we don't have absolute knowledge that octopuses suffer. There is clear evidence. When they are experimentally injured, octopuses cradle the hurt arm, they do respond to pain relief, and so on. Isn't this absolute knowledge as much as it would be if a human could not verbally self-report? Can we go too far in ameliorating our language in search of wide agreement?
I think that's a very fair question to ask. We have settled on quite a cautious form of words that does not involve talking of knowledge. So we're not asserting that we know octopuses feel pain. And of course, some people want to go beyond that, and that's entirely understandable. But I suppose there's a hope to bring the skeptics with us, the reasonable skeptics of the sort Dave was alluding to earlier, who would, of course, not agree to the claim of knowledge, but we think they should agree to the claim of at least a realistic possibility, and that when thinking about welfare risks, that is enough to warrant thinking about those risks. So I agree it is a delicate balance, but we wanted a statement that would not be just capturing a subset of the community of researchers working on these topics, but that really, if everyone thinks about the wording carefully and reflects on whether they could sign up to it, we wanted something that really everyone could, on reflection, sign up to.
Yeah,
Okay, Robert, and somebody asked that the speakers say their name at the beginning of their question.
Robert?
You should get the microphone there.
How important do you think consensus on a theory of consciousness is for raising the probability for animal consciousness? Since if consensus is important on scientific theories of consciousness that are mainly built for the human case, we might be in the vicinity of some epistemically dangerous recursivity there, as the theories of consciousness themselves are in need of probability raising for the human case. How do you think that impacts the research on animal consciousness?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what we have is a situation where we have uncertainty about the animals that are conscious and uncertainty about the theories. And so the research is going to be a calibration between the knowledge we get about animals and the theories. And I think that we'll be doing what we do in science and what we do in philosophy, getting some more empirical knowledge, recalibrating some of our theories, using those theories to generate new hypotheses, test those, and then decide whether we need to change the theory or not. I mean, it's part of the process, and it's slow and maybe frustrating to not know right now, but I'm really optimistic that with this new approach, by broadening the species that we study, that we will make progress on a secure theory in this incremental feedback loop.
That's right, yes. The feedback loop idea I really like, and the idea of iterative theory development, where the model is very much not, let's keep funding only human research and try and get a theory of consciousness worked out that way through evidence solely from humans, or perhaps humans plus some other primates. We think let's broaden the scope a lot and have an iterative theory development process in which our theories are refined by engaging with the evidence from as many relevant taxa as we can.
Okay, I'm blocked entirely from seeing this part of the room.
Hi, Alexandra Horowitz. Thinking about the language of your declaration, are there animals who have shown us in your mind that there is not a realistic possibility of consciousness, for you do exclude some invertebrates, and what kind of evidence would show lack of possibility, realistic possibility of consciousness? And should we be looking for that?
Yeah, we don't exclude other invertebrates, but the declaration is silent on them, reflecting a lack of agreement.
Yeah, we had a lot of discussion about jumping spiders and worms and other species as well. And we're basically decided that we don't yet have enough evidence to say anything about them. But this question about kind of negative markers is a really interesting one, because this marker methodology that we're using right now to decide confidence levels in animal consciousness only includes positive markers. Right? If we see a lack of something, because we don't have a theory, we don't know if that lack of something just correlates with conscious experience or is somehow causally involved in conscious experience. So we really don't have, at this point, a way to disqualify animal species from consciousness. I think we need a secure theory for that as well.
But this is fine. I mean, this is just an honest description of the state of the research as it is now, that the taxa mentioned in the declaration are ones where a substantial body of evidence exists that can support the claim to have established a realistic possibility. And then our view was that for the many, many other invertebrates out there, they're just not at that stage yet. And if a result of this is to stimulate more work on, for example, snails where there's very little evidence, or worms where there's very little evidence that allows an informed judgment about questions of consciousness, that would be great. I'd love to see more work on a wider range of invertebrate taxa.
At the back? Yeah, you.
Devin, my question is how should an illusionist think about this declaration when considering whether to sign it? So, should they just bluntly decide not to? Should they ask themselves, if I were to assume humans were conscious, this is what I would think about these other cases? Should they maybe defer to something else, like whatever they think the normative component of what we call consciousness is, or something else like access consciousness? How would you ask an illusionist to translate this?
They'd first have to decide what illusionism is, and then their view would depend on that. I think that for what Dave calls strong illusionists who deny there is such a thing as phenomenal consciousness, I think to a large extent they will have reservations about a declaration that uses that concept and takes it to be referring to something real and important. And we accept that, and we acknowledge that's a source of potential skepticism. But I think a lot of people who describe themselves as illusionists are not really going all the way to denying there is such a thing as phenomenal consciousness. They just think it's very different from what we might intuitively think it is, and that a lot of our intuitions about these topics lead us astray because they're substantially dualist in nature. And that kind of illusionist, the one that's rather closer to a standard materialist, I think can absolutely sign, and I might even myself count as one of those. So it very much depends on how strong your illusionism is.
I suppose.
Sorry, there's one here.
Hi, my name is Alessandra Yu. To what extent do you think the fields of affect and consciousness need to converge a little bit, such as the question of whether consciousness is inherently affective? For even sensory experiences, they don't necessarily have to be considered unnormed. They're still relevant to you. That's the reason you experience them at all. So yeah, I was just curious about this coming from the affective side.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent suggestion. I take it more of a suggestion than a question, or I'll answer your question with sure. Yeah, let's see more effective research in consciousness studies. The emphasis on vision has been longstanding, right, in sensory modalities, especially vision. Vision is very relevant for humans. It's less relevant for elephants and for other species, some reptiles perhaps, for bottlenose dolphins. So looking at affective systems, in addition to other sensory systems in animals, I think is going to be a way forward and make more progress. And integrating them sounds like a great idea. Yeah. So I hope people are doing that too.
Okay, here's one from another one from online. Love the cautious yet compassionate language of the Declaration. Question for Jonathan. Do you use sentience, the word, to mean both phenomenal consciousness broadly and specifically the subset that is affective or valenced, and is that potentially confusing? Does one just have to define the word sentience at every use?
Yeah, that's Georgia Mason, isn't it?
Yeah.
Question, yeah. Yeah, thanks very much, Giorgio. I really appreciated the kind remarks at the beginning. The question is a really good one about broad and narrower meanings of the term sentience. I think in the literature at the moment there is this clear broader sense that is capacity for phenomenal consciousness, subjective experience. And then there is a deliberate narrowing of it to refer to valenced subjective experience, experiences that feel good or feel bad. Now, if you're like me and if you think that that second group, that subset, is the subset that really matters for welfare and that matters ethically, then you'll be inclined to think that narrowing of the term sentience is actually a good idea. And I do think that. But others who perhaps don't share that starting assumption think the term should be used in the broader sense. And Stephen Harnad, editor of the journal Animal Sentience, has always been a powerful advocate for using it in that broader sense. So that's where we are. We've got these two senses. They're coexisting. I think it's reasonably clear how they relate to each other. So I don't think it is a huge problem. But of course, it can be, when you're trying to translate the research to the public, can potentially be a source of confusion because there are these two things you might mean. And both of these can be distinguished from use of the term sentience to just refer to responding or sensitivity to stimulation, which I really strongly discourage because I think that is a cheapening of the term, a trivializing of the term that means it no longer has anything to do with consciousness at all if we use it in that way.
Matthias Michel?
Yeah, I'm Matthias Michel. So I was just wondering about, so one way of, an alternative way of seeing the history that you presented is as a history of discovery about what can be done unconsciously. And that's how I see the history of cognitive science and consciousness research. Not as showing that, consciousness is required for many, many things, but as showing, the things we thought we could do only consciously, actually we can do them unconsciously. So what do you think the research on the capacities we can have unconsciously, how do you think this research should affect our credences in attributions of consciousness to non-human animals?
Yeah, great question, because this is exactly what the science has been doing for us. It's been telling us that things that we assumed we were doing with conscious experience, for humans even, we don't need conscious experience for. And so if we're looking at other species, some of the things that we just, using our common sense, might think are evidence of conscious experience aren't actually evidence of conscious experience. And this is why what makes it really important is that we do this difficult work in trying to figure out differences in behavior when an organism can report that they saw, for example, saw a stimulus versus reporting that they didn't see a stimulus and see how that impacts their behavior. That's the kind of work we need to continue encouraging, and not just using visual modalities, but using other modalities as well. That's what's going to get us really robust markers that we can use to raise our credence levels. So in the history, what I was suggesting is not that, the common sense views of animals, everybody already knew everything, we don't need to do science. No, not at all. And the idea is that this is a real part of science. It's a viable scientific area of discovery. And I think that that's what's true. But it's critical that we examine the unconscious behavior as well. Yeah, so thanks so much for raising that.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it needs to be part of the program. Think about the case of blindsight, which I know, Matthias, you've written extensively about. This is a sort of phenomenon where people are blind in part of their visual field due to a brain injury, and in some cases are able to perform surprisingly flexible behaviors using information that comes in through the blind part of the visual field. including in one famous case, apparently sort of navigating objects all the way along a corridor. So on the face of it, part of what this evidence is telling us is, well, things like navigating complex environments, don't be so sure to think those require conscious processing. At the same time, this evidence is showing a really fascinating dissociation of the conscious and the unconscious that we can go and look for in other animals. And a lot of the evidence in the blind sight literature comes from other primates. And in fact, according to Nick Humphrey's way of telling the story, the phenomenon was discovered in other primates and then found in humans. And you could argue that when you find something like that, when you find this dissociation between conscious and unconscious processing in a human and in another animal with the same functional profile in the two cases, that's some of the strongest evidence you could possibly get that there's conscious experience there in that other animal. So this type of work needs to be part of the emerging science of animal consciousness, both as a source of skeptical challenges, but also as a source of positive lines of evidence.
Okay, let's take a final question from Dan Zahavi.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate that it must be difficult to formulate a text that covers so many differences that might also be among the signatories. And I'm just wondering whether I spotted a certain disagreement between the two of you in your presentation, because Christian was talking about how bad it had been for Descartes to introduce the distinction between behavior and mind. And you seem to say that that divide is really catastrophic to some regards. Whereas Jonathan, I mean, when you were talking about on what basis we attribute consciousness to other creatures, you kept talking about inference to best explanation. Yeah. I'm just wondering, I mean, because I would have assumed that Christian's view doesn't really fit so well with that idea, but I would be curious to know whether you are disagreeing there.
I think Jonathan and I disagree about a few things, yeah.
But not about the relevance of inference to the best explanation here. I'm sure, Christian, you've been a strong advocate for that as well. Mm-hmm. To me, that is the method we're using in the sort of work we'll be hearing about later. It is not about developing a single test that decisively shows this animal is conscious, but about building up a picture through a profile of all kinds of different behaviors and neural markers as well, and then starting to say, well, what is the best explanation for this overall pattern?
Okay, thanks very much to both of you for a great session.
We will now have about 15 minutes for a coffee break so everybody can hang out, talk a little bit right in that next room, and then we will be back here shortly for the session on evidence regarding consciousness in vertebrates.